Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Think Tank Future Summit. My name is Scott Pasternak, and tonight represents the culmination of the three sessions that we've had with you all. So it's great to have everybody here this evening, and I think you'll really appreciate what we're going to talk to you all about tonight. So I think we look at this as a bit of a celebration of the work that's been done. So thank you for being here this evening, as well as for all your contributions. So what we want to cover tonight is just what I just walked through as far as the welcome, but then Brian's also going to share a few words to welcome you all in just a moment. And then we're going to turn things over to David and Heather. We're going to spend most of the time providing a recap of everything that we've done to reach this point of the summit. And then I'm going to spend just a few minutes to give you a sense of what else is going on within this broader project to develop the solid waste management strategy for Denton. And then from there, we'll open it up to see if anybody has any questions or comments that you would like to provide. Again, we'll be referring to the think tank report, and Heather has graciously provided a link to where that can be accessed in the chat box. So please take a look at that when you get a chance. And with that, Brian, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, again, on behalf of the City of Denton, I would like to thank everybody who has participated in this and trudged through us this process. Sometimes a little unsure of where we were going, but again, I think you'll see that we've got a very good result. Now, this is not the end result of our comprehensive solid waste management strategy. This is really sort of a springboard into the next part of the evaluation. We've done a waste characterization, we've done our future summit, and now what we have to figure out is, how do we combine all of these things to really come up with a process and a direction for the city to go? What tools do we have? What direction we need to go? How much is it going to cost? And what is most important for us? So again, some things we'll talk about here today really serve as a guidepost. It's like going from Denton to Austin. You take 35 south and it's fairly straightforward. You can go through Fort Worth, you can go through Dallas, you can go through Louisiana if you want and come back in. It's not efficient, but you can do that. And I think this gets us to the end point, and we're going to have to fill in the spaces in between. But what we'll talk about today is really sort of that, where we want to see Denton and what those characteristics look like. So again, thank you all, whether you're a member of the think tank, whether you're city staff, whether you're part of Future IQ or Burns and McDonald. This is an exciting part that we're working on here, and appreciate all your time and effort. So I will throw it back to you, Scott.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Just a couple of thoughts before I turn things over to David. You have seen this slide before if you've participated, but just a couple of housekeeping notes. To the extent that you do have any thing that you would like to talk about this evening, please feel free to utilize the chat box, and then later on when we get into the question and answer period, feel free to either just talk, or if somebody else is speaking, please go ahead and use the raise your hand function. And if and when David tells any great jokes, you can also use the laugh emoji or so forth and so on. So I noticed there's no like booing type emojis for your benefit there, David. Also, as a reminder, we are recording this session just like we have each of the others. So if everybody could please just go ahead and be on mute when you're not speaking, just so we don't get any unintended background noise. So with that, David, please go ahead.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Scott. And good evening, everybody. And Brian, thank you for those comments, teeing this up too. I think that was puts it in a good context. So I just wanted to not take a huge amount of time tonight, but I wanted to basically just quickly recap, sort of leading to where we got to at the end of module 3, so the scenario development component. And then if you remember at the end of that, we asked you to go and take a survey essentially straight after the after that session. So I want to share with you the results from that primarily, and then have an opportunity for a bit of a discussion and sort of some questions about what that's telling us, right? Because I think very much to Brian's point, I think we're answering the question about trajectory, and I think we're starting to get some sentiment about velocity, right? And of course, then pragmatics kick in, right? Because then it's, what does it cost you to make the kind of move that you want to make? So I just want to kind of have a chance to talk through some of that. So next one, please, Scott. All right. So if you remember, we started off sort of module 3 with the this think tank sort of scenario matrix. And we were playing out, and this was really built up from obviously a lot of preceding discussion, other work we've done with solid waste management, recycling, but also very much consistent with the survey results that we saw, which is sort of playing out the future around these 2 big axes. So one was about what ifs around how things might change at the level of societal attitudes and behaviour, consumption culture through to the reduce, reuse, recycle. And the other axis was around the impacts of technology and policy, and thinking of the what ifs if we pursue a low cost sort of low tech sort of approach, or we pivot to a much more higher input technology driven solutions. And that created these scenario spaces, which we randomly allocated people to those in the last session. Scott, next one, please. And I'm not going to go into the full detail of these. These are built out in the report. We took all your notes and sort of massaged those into some really good, I think, narratives about the future. But at the high level, there were these big scenario names, right? So greed without guilt was this future where, if we pursue a consumption culture, but we just rely on technology to solve the problems, the name of that obviously implies this notion of, we're just going to buy what we want, get it delivered to us immediately. We're not going to feel guilty about that because we know that the problem gets solved at the back end through really good technology driven solutions in terms of waste management and so on. The change the future now was a very different possible scenario. This is where we coupled technology driven solutions with a societal and community shift in attitudes and behaviour. So we really push heavily on the reduce, reuse, recycle, couple that with technology, and produces a different set of outcomes at the level of Denton and the surrounding areas. Then there was the low tech recycling community, which is where not really sort of pushing on the technology or the cost, but we're going to apply the sort of principles of recycling, and you'd see a lot more in that future of the community, sort of repurposing and having secondhand shops, those type of things is how they sort of talked about that. And then there was the trash trouble scenario, which Scott was the facilitator for, which is sort of playing out this consumption culture coupled with the low cost, low tech policy options. And I think the name gives you the insight into that future scenario, which is where basically we sort of end up with, getting a little overwhelmed with the amount of material coming at us, and we don't have good systems sort of to solve it, right? So that was the sort of high level discussions we had, just to kind of trigger your memories on that one. What we then did, right, if you remember in the survey at the end, we asked you to think about expected and preferred future. And so this is the plot from the responses to expected and preferred. So this will be new information for you, unless you've read the report, which I'm not sure many have, but it's in there, right? So this is the green circles is the point in this sort of 100 cell or 100 scenario future where people said, well, this is where we think we're going to end up if we just keep doing what we're currently doing, right? And the size of the circle reflects the number of responses. So the larger the circle, the more people responded at that point. The blue dots reflect what people distinguished as their preferred future. In other words, where should we be aiming, or where would you most preferentially have solid waste management recycling end up in the city of Denton, looking at, of course, at 2040. And what's really intriguing about this is, and while our data and numbers on this aren't huge, I think this is it's very reflective of what we've seen in all the preceding rapid polling and in the community survey, which is, people are concerned about the direction at the level of expected, that we're sort of heading towards, majority are saying we're heading towards this maybe trash trouble, greed without guilt sort of future. But the preferred future is fascinating to me because it's diametrically opposed. It is skewed very heavily towards change the future now. And I'm always interested in two things, and I've talked about this a number of times. I'm interested in trajectory, so where do you want to go, and velocity, so how fast do you want to get there, and how much sort of appetite do you have for where you want to go. And it's interesting that the largest response point on this is at the 10-10. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner there, that large blue circle. And that's maximum change, essentially, right? So you could sort of think of this as the way people are interpreting this, that the lower left is probably less change or more status quo. The upper right is maximum change, because we're really pushing on the ends of those continuums around solutions or societal and behavioural change. And so I think this gives us a really good framework for the next part that Scott's going to really lend his expertise to, which is the strategy. So how do you get from that expected future to the preferred future? And that's going to require pivoting, if you think about it, along both axes. So thinking about how do you help shape community attitudes and behaviour, and how do you think about really clever technology solutions, bringing those two things together to create the future now scenario. And I want to have some discussion about this, but I want to show you just a couple more pieces first, right? So Scott, if we can go to the next one. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to, just because you may not have read, I'm just going to pull out the highlights of how we describe scenario B, or how the group did that work. These are in the report, so this is the sort of format that we've got. So scenario B is that upper right-hand corner, change the future now. Very much this is a future where the community consumption patterns reflects attitudes and behaviours. So in other words, by pushing on the reduce, reuse, recycle, we'd see consumption patterns start to drop. People are more conscious about what they're buying, and the sort of what comes in the packaging, and what materials they're bringing into their environment. And so there's a sense of a collective responsibility around sustainable waste management policies. And then, of course, the advanced technologies allow us to be able to really do clever things with that waste. So it's not just about sorting and distributing. It's actually also about, in this future, is thinking about how do we apply that to help us with some of our zero waste goals and so on. So next one, Scott. So, and then in each of these scenarios, and this is again is for the scenario B, the change the future now, and I just pulled out the high level points that are in the report under consumption patterns and waste types. So this is the 2040 predictions, policy settings and application technology, waste management systems being utilised, and then some of the headline news. So here people were talking about in this future, which remember, this is the one that people picked out as the preferred one. There's a continuous investment in consumer education with a focus on collective responsibility and shared solutions. So that's a pretty big underpinning part of this narrative, right? We're in this together, and we need to kind of educate ourselves about how we collectively, intervene in our waste streams, even before they get to us, right? The policy settings and application technology, we're really going to be pushing on that. And what they sort of forecast was that the endpoint goal on this is really that we get to a no land use scenario by 2040. So this is a sort of a zero waste trajectory, but out over a 20-year period. And the solid waste management systems expand from the local level to start to have system-wide impact. And that's really consistent with the survey and some of the rapid polling, where people saw the opportunity for Denton to be a bit of a leader in some of these topic areas at a broader than just the city limit perspective. Some of the headline news, was things about continuous investment in the consumer. So this whole notion that we're going to invest in our citizenry and sort of work together on this. Then the Denton County becomes Dallas County, leads Dallas County in recycling numbers, and then organics provide all the power for the city of Denton. And so that notion of that we're being really clever about our waste. So that's this sort of real high level summary of this preferred future. There's more material, of course, in the final report. Next one, Scott. And just a couple of data points too. So this is starting to now pick up velocity. We did ask a question in the survey, which was how quickly do you think think the City of Denton needs to adopt and pursue the strategies to achieve that preferred future. 1 was not urgent right now, 10 was critically urgent right now. So the bar at the right-hand side that says 22%, that's the colour code for the 10. So all people were in the response points of 10, 9, 8 or 7, right? And roughly half and half between 7 and then 8, 9 or 10. So in this type of continuum, which is not urgent right now to critically urgent right now, these are all responses that fall into something like an urgent or pretty urgent type of a perception. So I think that tells us a bit about ambition when you start to think about pace of change, and how you start to sort of design strategy to get you there with a certain sense of momentum and gusto. Next one, Scott. And this is my last one, just to kind of finish framing this out. This was actually from our rapid polling, but I just thought it'd be good to put this back in to remind us in terms of when we think about appetite and velocity, the future posture that Denton should adopt relative to similar Texas cities. Strive to be a leading role model community, way out there at 73%. Stay abreast of evolving proven trends, 27%, but then nobody's really got any appetite for, just staying where we are, or even reducing the involvement and investments. So I think if you just take that kind of set of data points in that larger story, we have a very interesting desire here in the community, I think, for something that's going to be pretty original, and something that's going to be ambitious in terms of a solid waste management strategy. So, Scott, my next slide, I think, is just a prompt for questions and discussion, and we have a few minutes. So I thought it'd be really great to get people's reaction to that, because you're seeing this data for the first time, and I think it's really important for us as we pivot to the next part of this is to be just to really think about what does this appetite mean, because I know once Scott particularly starts to get into the strategy development, and then we start to say, well, what does this cost and all that kind of stuff, you start to see people tap the brakes a bit in terms of speed and ambition, right? And I wanted to just have one last sort of chance to check in with everybody here about, are you seeing that data point to the same type of thing that I am, right? And how do we remind ourselves of that as we go through strategy development? Because it's easy to think big and make bold promises when you're not an elected official, for example, but or when you're not paying the bill, right? But once you start getting into decisions, priorities, budgeting, and those type of things, the reality sets in, right? So, and then if we're really serious about this, then it's worth just going, okay, let's stay the course here, or how much resolve do we have to stay the course, right? So I just thought, Scott, it might be just nice in our transition here just to let people weigh in on that a little bit, and just to make sure we're not sort of putting the goalpost too far out, or that we're collectively interpreting the data and the sentiment in the same way. So with that, I just would like to throw it open for people who may want to, share your reflections on that data, particularly the expected and the preferred, and what that's telling you in terms of desire for change in the community. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Scott. That's great.
Hey, I'll start off while others are thinking about great questions to ask you, David.
Yeah.
A little bit earlier, I thought you said you thought that it was very interesting that for the expected future, most of the answers were in this bottom left quadrant, but then for the preferred, they were in the top right.
Yeah.
And with you and Heather doing these types of projects for other clients, across a whole different range of issues, but going through I think a relatively consistent methodology, right?
Yeah.
How often do you see these types of answers? To me, it seems like this is like really pretty clear as far as what folks see as far as the expected and how different it is from the preferred. So how typical is it?
Well, it's a really good question, actually. So generally, there is a difference between the expected and the preferred because, you know, we're always involved in a planning process, right? So, and the context for a planning process is often a, you know, a checkpoint about our future trajectory, and you know, these type of things, I guess, are really only ever done sort of every decade or so. So you would expect some change to occur. But just as an example, so we did a community visioning in Capel, Texas, which is, you could probably throw a rock and hit Capel from where you are, right? And when we got to the preferred future, they were spread right across, right? So, I mean, they had quite differing views in different parts of the community about what their preferred future was. Slightly different context, of course, right? What I have seen in the topic of solid waste management and recycling, and we work, Scott, with your company, of course, in some work in Iowa on this, and we're working in McKinney, so I think it'll be fascinating to see how McKinney plays out on this as well. But I think that 10-10, that's why I called that out, because you've got a big concentration of desire up there, and what I'm seeing in solid waste management and recycling is a little bit more of that extreme desire, and I think that's reflecting societal changes. You know, I think we talked about this in the first module, is that, you know, we work across all different sort of sectors of society, you know, everything from defence economies to high school students, right, and sort of all points in between. And I think the issue about our environmental performance is much more on people's minds than most people give it credit for. You know, you look at the underlying, you know, and I think it got kind of confused in that, you know, climate change, is it, you know, man-made and all that kind of stuff we went through, and, you know, it was politicised to a fair degree. But under the surface of that, in all the data I see and all the interactions we have, I think people, by and large, are pretty concerned about what we're doing to the planet, right? And at the level of, and at very pragmatic levels, and I think that's where it hits in on solid waste management, plastic, pollution of plastics, right? I mean, how many articles do you read that there is now, you can find plastics on the highest point on the planet, the lowest point in the ocean, you know, and particularly for younger cohorts, and we saw that in the community survey, the young, you know, sort of middle, you know, 40s and below, people are very sensitized to issues of environmental impact and pollution, particularly around things that there are easy solutions for, right? I mean, I think we're just on a tipping point, right? We're on a point where people are demanding change because the solutions are there, right? And so people are just sort of saying, let's just get on with it, right? So, but I think, and so that's why I think that, you know, if you look at the community survey, which was a lot more people, and this data, they're really saying the same thing, which is we need to improve our performance on at least the basic stuff really fast, right? And let's get on with this game, right? Let's, you know, let's not lose sight of, you know, we've got some things to fix up, and then we can get ahead and start to be, you know, improving and finding new solutions. So that was a kind of a long answer, but I do think that I would not, you know, for you guys who are going to carry this forward, right, that look at that top right hand corner, because that reflects a big appetite for community change, right? So I think you have a big permission and expectation to see some solutions come forward.
All right, that's great perspective, so I appreciate that very much, David. Does anybody else have any other comments or questions? So, Mary, I think it's awesome that you have your camera, and I love the smile that you've had during this discussion so far. And I was just kind of curious, is that where you're just saying, wow, this all looks great, or is it just being able to, you know, see all of us, you know, great looking guys on
No, that's it. That's absolutely it. You guys are just so fabulous looking. I'm like, wow, GQ all the way. Absolutely. No, I was excited to see all of this, because this is exactly what I put on my survey. I put the 3 and the 4 and the expected, and the 10 and the 10 for the preferred. And I'm excited to see that there are a lot of people that are thinking the way I'm thinking as well. And I was in the Change the Future Now group. Mm-hmm. And I was excited to see a lot of my ideas that are on your chart. So I'm like, yeah, people are thinking the same, or maybe I'm thinking the same way as other people. Other people are thinking the same way as I am, which means we have a group of people that really are looking forward to, as David said, an intense amount of change and in a fairly short period of time. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, no, that without what you just said is awesome. And I was hoping that you were going to say something along those lines. So thank you so much for what you mentioned there. That's great to hear. And Brian, you have your hand raised as well. So please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask sort of a follow-up from your question, and that in other municipalities, as they've gone forward on their preferred vectors,
Yeah.
But then they start including price tag. How much does the aspirational goals drop off, or are they fairly well maintained?
Yeah. So our, and Scott, I'll have a go at this, and perhaps you have a perspective on this as well, of course, right? So what we've seen is, I think the initial stuff, when you start to go the next step, right, which is what I see in sort of visioning and sort of planning, is people will point out the stuff that makes no sense to them straight away. And the stuff that makes no sense is, why are we throwing organic matter in with general household waste, right? I mean, that's a fairly easy diversion solution straight up. You know, why do we have 4 companies running these huge trucks up and down the road, picking up garbage on different days? Can't we kind of figure this out? You know, people see those kind of things as just not making sense, right? But I think as you get into the more complex part of it, I think the story about, does it cost more, or does some investment at the start deliver you real solutions down the track? I think that becomes an important part of the story to keep in people's minds to figure this out. And for example, if you look at the Change the Future Now, the headline news in 2040, if I recall it correctly, was that, you know, Denton, city of Denton, you know, produces all its own power. So you get you know, this ability to be able to create these closed or circular economies. And so I think it's a mistake to think that technology is going to just always cost you money, or technology solutions, right? I mean, I think the notion of a circular economy, which is sort of where this is heading, the idea is that you will actually be able to extract significant cost savings, and then all sorts of innovation as well. You know, I think, and Mary, you might talk to this, but my recollection of your presentation, there was talk about, you know, organic matter that was, you know, powering your own sort of agricultural systems and greenhouses and resources being recycled and so on, right? So there is a whole body of work that gets really exciting once you get into this world, but you've got to get over a hump, right? So you've got to get over a hump of changing the system, and any systemic change is going to require some investment of energy of some sort, whether it be, you know, thinking, education, some initial capital, whatever, right? Because you know, a state change always requires some sort of investment of energy, however we accumulate that in society and apply it, whether it's, you know, Brian and his team working really hard and educating people, or it's, you know, some really creative solutions of elected officials negotiating, you know, how we do things, all that kind of stuff, right? You've got to put that energy in. But then I do think the prevailing thinking in other examples, you get over that hump, and then you start to see an accrual of a lot of sort of benefits that can be quite important. And I wouldn't underestimate the one around how quickly things like wastewater and those type of components are going to couple in on your management of your outflow from your community. Solid waste is our topic here, but I think pretty quickly you're going to see that line up with some narrative around water waste and so on, because, you know, those issues are, you know, they're going to be on your plate as a community to make some tough decisions about sooner or later.
Well,
yeah, go ahead, please, Brian.
Yeah, and I think we've also got to keep in mind that you know, whether it's the city of Denton or any other city that's trying to undergo this, it is a marathon and not a sprint, and a lot of that is about resource management. You know, not trying to get out too far ahead of the pack to begin with, but, you know, creating a plan where you're creating momentum as you're moving along, and those synergies, and a lot of that, you know, is like trying to capture a lot of that low-hanging fruit on the front end, but recognizing you don't want to hinder anything on the long end either. So, moving along in a very, very dedicated and deliberate manner to affect that change. And by being deliberate, not just doing it because somebody else is doing it or it looks good, I think is really where we make the hay in getting this strategy implemented.
So let me make a point here because Brian, I think you asked a very good question on the financial side, and what I think is so interesting in that is, so when the city issued its original RFP, one of the topics or tasks that they said they wanted to have us as the consultant evaluate is the existing education and outreach program, right? And I think the reason for that is twofold. One is that on a regional basis, there's a recognition that if we can do a more effective job of changing people's behavior, that can really be a very cost-effective way to increase recycling and reduce what's going to the landfill. And part of the reason why I think that it's so interesting is that the city staff identified that. And then when you all were doing your brainstorming for this particular group, over here on the left-hand side where it talks about consumption patterns and waste types, the key takeaway there is that there's a continuous investment in consumer education with a focus on collective responsibility and shared solutions. And to tie this back on the financial side, the reason why I think this is so important is that not everything that we'll evaluate from a strategy perspective is necessarily going to be a high cost type of effort. There may certainly be some things, and that's going to be a part of the planning process to figure out exactly what we're going to evaluate the costs of. We just haven't gotten to that point yet. But when it comes to education and behavior change, relatively speaking, that's not that expensive, because if you think about it, you've already got all the infrastructure out there that's been deployed in terms of all the investment that the city's made in its collection vehicles, all the great people working for the city, as well as the processing facilities of where that material is either being composted on the organic side or recycled. And so really it's just a relatively small incremental cost if you can get people to successfully change their behavior. And so I think that's where it's important to recognize that the city, you all participating in this process, have already kind of recognized that. That'll be a part of our job to tie that back to what does that mean from a financial perspective.
I would be surprised if a 3-college town didn't value education.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And then in a few minutes, when I talk through some of the efforts that we're going to be evaluating as far as different options and strategies, again, taking a specific look at what the city is doing from an education and outreach perspective is already, like I said, a part of what the city has asked us to do. So I think that just further highlights the importance of that. So Brian and Mary, thank you very much for the points that you all have made. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments or anything else from Mary or Brian? Yeah, Mary, please go ahead.
I just, one last thing is, I think that, and I know this is true for me too, a lot of us tend to think that we're kind of isolated and that maybe what we think or do doesn't mean anything, or nobody's listening, or it doesn't matter. So when you, and like I said, this is really exciting to see how many people think the same way. I think once everybody understands it, pretty much everybody is thinking the same way and has the same thoughts and the same desires, that the education and any of the process is going to be a real easy sell because we're all in it together, and we didn't know we were in it together, but we actually are. So I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think that's a great benefit of this process, to be able to get a sense of what that shared vision is within the community. So that's great. Really, really appreciate everything you've said tonight, Mary. So thank you so much. Any other thoughts? Let me just talk briefly about what some of the other aspects of the project are, as well as what's coming up next, and I'll go through this fairly quickly, so we'll have a few more minutes. If anybody does have any additional questions or comments, you'll have an opportunity to talk about that then before we close up. So this just gives you kind of a 10,000-foot perspective of our strategic planning process that we're working on with you all. And so I'll start with what's at the bottom of the slide, as that communicates the city and stakeholder engagement and public outreach efforts. So the most important aspect of that is what we have been doing with you all via the think tank. And thank you again so very much for making this process what it's become. We will also be presenting this information toward the end of the project with city council as well as with the utility board. So there'll be more to come on that front. But in terms of what we've been doing so far, in terms of the evaluation of the existing system effort, and these are efforts that have been ongoing to some extent, but also we've been wanting to see what the outcome would be of this process before we got too far into the process, just to make sure that we would be really aware of key things, even though it was already in our scope, but just to understand and appreciate the importance of education and outreach, like we just talked about. I think just has me just put an extra star next to that topic. We will also be looking at issues such as waste projections to understand what is the life of your existing facilities, as well as looking at not just the projections for the landfill, but also other really important infrastructure like recycling, composting, and transfer station facilities that are going to be needed out into the future. We did complete last year, as one of actually the first things that we did was the composition study, where we actually spent an entire week sorting through the city's trash and recycling coming from single family residents, multifamily apartment complexes, and businesses. So that's really key data that will help to inform the analysis that we're doing, especially from an education and outreach perspective, because we have a really good understanding of material that should be recycled, how much of that is truly being recycled, and unfortunately what part of that ends up going into the trash that could be recycled, and that type of information. So going from left to right, that second box is going to be where we will help the city to figure out what some of the key goals and objectives are for this strategic effort. And I think that this think tank is really going to play a critical role to informing that, in terms of what David described. I love that in terms of talking about the velocity and the direction that things are going, as far as, I think that gives us some perspective that there is seemingly a true sense of urgency on a lot of these issues. And then we're going to be evaluating a number of different alternatives and evaluating those respective options. So education and outreach efforts are just one. But then another key one will be to look to evaluate infrastructure issues like I talked about as well. So it's going to really run the gamut within the solid waste management system, from the infrastructure to what's being done from an education and outreach perspective. And then going back to the question that you asked earlier, Brian, we will work with the city to identify several key strategies so that we can help the city to understand, okay, what is it going to really cost if you look to address those specific strategies. And then we'll have some further discussions and workshops with city staff. And then as that's completed, toward the end of this year is when we will then work to develop the long-term implementation and funding plan, develop the schedule for when efforts will be implemented in the future, and then to write the strategy. So with that, that gives you just kind of again, a big picture perspective of what we've done and what's yet to come as part of the project. But let me just pause there and see if anybody has any further questions we can answer. And it looks like, Brian, you're typing. Anything you want to verbally mention, or you want to just keep typing what we're writing?
Yeah, I don't mind asking it. This harkens back to my statement of the glib statement, but it's apropos now of a 3-college town. To what extent do we think that the strategic planning is going to include R&D opportunities with the universities? There's education, engineering, chemistry, biology, ecology that are all meaningful to these endeavors, and they have been underway. But I'm curious if we couldn't lower costs and leverage expertise for some of these strategic plans in that regard.
Sure, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail right on the head, and that's really where we want to go. Historically, we've not worked closely with our universities in the city of Denton to help provide innovative solutions, and that's part of what we want to do as part of this education and outreach, is create opportunities that first and foremost help drive the improvements to the system, but secondarily also try to help train the next level of people that will be sitting in my seat and the other people that are in the solid, helping run and manage and operate solid waste recycling department here, because just like engineers and bricklayers and people like that, there's a shortage of people right now. So if we get the interest built and get it built in the right way, not only are we lowering cost on the front end, but we're also creating that workforce that will help fill these critical positions in the coming years.
Right. Yeah, great perspective there. So thank you to both Brians there. Does anybody else have any other thoughts or questions as we keep moving forward? All right. So that really wraps up what we wanted to present. And so again, there is an opportunity if you want to continue to stay involved, just to please go to the project website. As I mentioned at the very beginning of our session, maybe before we started the recording, the think tank report is final. It's available on that website. Also, there's a link in the chat that'll take you directly to where that information is. So I really appreciate the work that David and Heather did to produce an awesome report, but what's really even that much better about it is the content. Content is really, it's all based on everything that we've talked about over the last several sessions, and so it's really really a grassroots endeavor there, to where it's just purely reflective of what you all communicated during those various sessions, and for that, we thank you very much for it, because it's going to be extremely helpful in providing that kind of a compass, if you will, in terms of the efforts and collaboration that we'll continue to have with the city as we move forward to develop this strategy. So with that, I'll just ask one more time, does anybody have any other questions or thoughts? I will say that it's pretty awesome as well how that ray of sunshine is coming in and the Brian's window behind us. So only gives a great effect for I think the outcome of this process. So with that, David or Brian, are there any additional closing comments that you would like to offer? Please go ahead.
Yeah, just the only comment, Scott, I just really want to just highlight what you just said. I think what's been the beauty of this is that this has been a really community-driven process, and so often these type of topic areas, the technocrats take over, right? But this, the community's had every chance to weigh in on this, and I really like your comments, Mary, too, about I think this has provided an opportunity for people to realise that there are a lot of these topics on individuals' minds, but we don't really get together and talk about solid waste management. It's not like it's not a barroom chat or anything like that, right? But I think actually creating this forum, and really credit to Brian and his team for doing that, it's allowed, I think, that discovery of this common interest that people have about how do you make your environment conducive, and how do you play your part in a bigger story about how we look after our own backyard, but how do we look after resources, and how do we make sure we're doing this as best as we can. So I think I just love community-driven processes, because I do have a real firm belief that we're often surprised on the upside by what comes out of a good collective community conversation, because you're really tapping into people's deeper aspirations and desires. So I mean, we're signing out of this process at this point, and Scott, I did want to just take the opportunity to Brian and his team, but also to you as a community, just to say thank you for the opportunity to weigh in on this and be part of it, right? Because it's been actually really enjoyable, right? And the report, the content of the report is your content, right? That was your deliberations, and hopefully we've done a good job of sort of articulating that, bringing it to the foreground. But walk away from this phase one or task one knowing that this is your work, right? And between Scott and his team and Future IQ and our team, Heather and I, it's been our delight to work with you. So thank you.
All right, great thoughts there. Thank you, David. Brian?
Yeah, just a quick note, and again, thank you for the support and your persistence as we've gone through this process. Like David was saying, the community voices help drive what we're trying to do here, and we appreciate the input. It really gives us a sort of a focus, and if nothing else, a wayfarer mark to guide where we want to go here. So thank you for your input, and we look forward to your continued participation as we move forward in this process.
All right, awesome. Mary, I will let you have the closing thought of the evening.
I apologize. I should have jumped in before. I thought I was going to have a couple more minutes. It was kind of along the same lines of what the Brian B. Oh, you're both Brian B's. Okay, Brian W.B. said about the colleges and universities, and this is something that throughout this whole process I've been really kind of excited about, is we have lots of think tank type people for lots of research and fresh ideas in the colleges and universities. I mean, we could even have, projects, final projects, master's degree projects or something like that, where they can come up with all kinds of things where it's not going to cost us anything. And we've got just all kinds of opportunities. So I'm glad Brian mentioned that, because I was thinking something along the same lines, is that we've got lots of brains that we can pick in our colleges and universities and have lots of projects and joint endeavors with them. So I'm just excited about this whole process and seeing where we're going to go from now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, and I just love your enthusiasm this evening, Mary. So before we wrap up, just open it up to the group one last moment to see if anybody else has anything else. All right, well, Mary, you keep smiling. Lights up the room. And I again thank everybody so much for this great process, and stay tuned as we continue to collaborate with Brian and his team to take the next steps to develop this strategy for the city of Denton. So everybody have a great night, and thanks very much.
Thank you.